She didn't scream when he hit her the last time. She had stopped screaming years ago. She just picked herself up off the kitchen floor, pressed her shaking fingers against her bleeding lip, and made a decision that would either save her life or end it completely. She packed one bag. She left before dawn. And she never looked back. If this story already has your heart, please take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below telling me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The stagecoach rocked hard against the frozen Montana road, and every jolt sent a sharp pain shooting through Clara Whitmore's ribs. She kept her face turned toward the window. Not because there was anything worth looking at. The landscape was nothing but gray sky and dead grass stretching on forever, but because she didn't want the other passengers to see her face. She knew what it looked like. She had seen it in the cracked mirror before she left Pennsylvania. The bruise along her left cheekbone had turned the color of a plum. Her bottom lip was split clean through, crusted over now, but still swollen enough that she had trouble speaking without pain. And beneath the high collar of her wool coat, pressed carefully against her skin where no one could see, were the older marks, the ones that had faded to yellow and green, the ones that told the longer story. She was 22 years old. She felt about 100. The man sitting across from her, a traveling merchant with a round belly and kind enough eyes, had tried twice to make conversation. She had answered both times with as few words as possible and kept her face angled away. She wasn't being rude. She had simply learned a long time ago that people who noticed things asked questions, and questions led to explanations, and explanations led to exactly the kind of attention she could not afford right now. She pressed her fingers against the small letter folded inside her coat pocket. She had read it so many times she could recite it from memory. Dear Miss Whitmore, my name is Nathaniel Walker. I own a cattle ranch outside Red Hollow, Montana. I am 34 years of age, in good health, and in need of a wife who is willing to build something honest. I cannot promise luxury. I can promise safety, fair treatment, and a roof that will never be taken from you. If those things matter to you, I believe we may suit one another well. Yours respectfully, Nathaniel Walker. Safety. That single word had made her cry the first time she read it. Not soft, delicate crying. Ugly, desperate crying, the kind she had pressed into her pillow at 3 a.m, so no one in the house would hear. Safety. She had written back within the hour. She had not told him the truth, not all of it. She had said only that she was a seamstress, that she was young and strong and willing to work hard, and that she was looking for a fresh start somewhere far from where she had been. She had not mentioned the man she was running from. She had not mentioned that the reason she needed a fresh start was because staying in Pennsylvania would eventually get her killed. The stagecoach lurched hard, and she grabbed the edge of the seat, wincing as her ribs protested sharply. "You all right, miss?" the merchant asked, looking up from his paper. "Fine," she said quietly. "Just the road." He nodded and went back to reading. She exhaled slowly and turned back to the window. Red Hollow was 2 more hours away. She didn't know what she would find there. She didn't know if Nathaniel Walker was truly the man his letter suggested, or whether she had made the most catastrophic mistake of her life by trusting a piece of paper from a stranger. She had heard stories. Everyone had heard stories of women who answered advertisements and arrived to find something very different from what had been promised. But the alternative had been to stay. And staying was no longer something she could survive. So she had packed her one bag, pressed the folded letter against her heart, and climbed onto the stagecoach with nothing but the clothes on her back and the quiet, desperate prayer that this time, just this once, something in her life might actually go the way it was supposed to. The stagecoach rolled on through the gray Montana afternoon. Clara Whitmore kept her face turned to the window, her fingers wrapped tight around the letter in her pocket, and waited. Red Hollow was smaller than she had imagined. One main street of weathered wooden buildings. A general store, a post office, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple. A few horses tied to posts along the road. A handful of people moving through the cold heads, down scarves, pulled up breath, coming in white puffs against the frozen air. The stagecoach pulled to a stop in front of what appeared to be a small inn, and the driver climbed down from his seat and opened the door. "Red Hollow," he announced, like he was delivering royalty somewhere grand. Clara was the last one off. She stepped down carefully, keeping her face angled toward the ground, and reached back up for her bag. The driver handed it down without comment. She thanked him quietly and stepped back, pressing herself slightly against the side of the coach while she got her bearings. She scanned the street. She was looking for the man who matched the description she had built in her mind. Tall, she had decided, with a weathered face and quiet eyes. Maybe a gray hat. Maybe a horse tied nearby. She wasn't sure. She had no real information to go on, just the letter and the picture she had constructed around those careful, measured words. What she found instead was silence. No one was waiting. No one. She stood on the wooden boardwalk in the bitter Montana cold, her bag at her feet and her bruised face burning in the wind, and she realized with a slow, sinking certainty that Nathaniel Walker had not come to meet her. The other passengers dispersed quickly. The merchant shook her hand briefly and wished her luck. The young couple who had been seated at the back of the coach hurried off down the street together. The stagecoach driver climbed back up to his seat and clicked at his horses. And then the coach was moving, pulling away down the street, and Clara was alone. She stood very still for a moment. She did not let herself panic. She had gotten very good over the years at not letting herself panic. Panic showed on your face, and she had learned early that a face that showed too much was a face that attracted the wrong kind of attention. So she breathed in slowly through her nose, breathed out slowly through her mouth, and told herself to think. She had a name, Nathaniel Walker, and a Ranch Walker Ranch he had mentioned outside Red Hollow. If she could find the post office or the general store, someone might be able to tell her how to get there. She picked up her bag. "You the woman who answered Nate Walker's advertisement?" She startled at the voice. She couldn't help it, even after all her practice at staying still, and turned to find a woman standing a few feet away on the boardwalk. She was perhaps 50, round-faced and sharp-eyed, with a green coat and a basket over one arm. She was looking at Clara with an expression that wasn't quite kind and wasn't quite unkind either, more like a woman doing a very careful inventory. Clara swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Clara Whitmore." The woman's eyes moved to Clara's face. They stayed there for a moment, a beat too long, and Clara resisted the urge to turn away. She had gotten used to people looking. She had not gotten used to the particular discomfort of being seen. "Edna Marsh," the woman said finally. "My husband runs the general store. Nate Walker sent word this morning that his wagon broke an axle outside of town. He's been working to fix it since before noon." She paused. "He asked me to watch for you and make sure you weren't left standing in the cold." Clara felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. Not much, but a little. "That was kind of him," she said carefully. Edna's eyes moved over her face again briefly, and then dropped to the bag in her hand. "Come inside. I've got coffee on." The general store was warm, which was the best thing Clara could say about it. She sat at the small table near the stove in the back, where Edna apparently received visitors, and she wrapped both hands around the tin mug she was offered, and let the heat travel up into her fingers. Edna moved around the store with efficient, practiced motions, restocking a shelf of canned goods while they talked. "How long's the journey take from Pennsylvania?" she asked. "About 10 days by rail and coach," Clara said. "I left a week ago Monday." "Long trip." Edna glanced over her shoulder. "You travel alone the whole way?" "Yes, ma'am." Another glance. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 22. Nate's 34. Edna set a tin of beans on the shelf and picked up another. "Good man, quiet, keeps to himself more than he should maybe, but decent. You won't find many as decent as him in this territory." Clara nodded. She was watching the door. She couldn't help it. Watching doors had become a habit she didn't know how to break. "He know?" Edna asked. Clara turned. "Ma'am?" The woman had stopped restocking the shelf. She was standing with her back still half-turned, a can of tomatoes in one hand, and she was looking at Clara in that direct, careful way again. "Does Nate know?" Edna repeated slowly, "What you came here running from." The silence stretched out between them. Clara's hands tightened around the mug. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Edna looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the shelf and set the tomatoes down gently. "All right," she said. "Drink your coffee." Nathaniel Walker arrived 40 minutes later. Clara heard the wagon outside, heard the horses, heard boots on the boardwalk, and then the door opened, and he came in, bringing the cold with him and stomping snow off his boots before he even fully cleared the threshold. She stood up. He was taller than she had imagined. Broader through the shoulders, too, the kind of build that came from actual work, from hauling and lifting and doing, not from show. His coat was dark and worn at the collar, his hat pulled low, and when he pulled it off and looked around the store, she could see his face clearly for the first time. It was not a handsome face in any conventional sense. It was a hard face, the face of a man who had spent years in the wind and sun, with lines around the eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the Montana mountains. But the eyes themselves were different from the rest of him. They were gray quiet and very direct. They found her immediately. She stood there beside the table with her hands clasped in front of her, her bag at her feet, and she made herself hold still and meet his gaze. She was very aware in that moment of exactly what he was looking at. She could feel the bruise on her cheek as clearly as if someone were pressing a thumb against it. His face didn't change. That was the thing that struck her most about it. Not the way men usually reacted when they saw her face, which was either a flinch and a quick look away, or a too long stare that made her skin crawl. He simply looked at her the same way he had looked at the door when he came in, like she was a fact to be understood, rather than a spectacle to be commented on. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and even. Not warm exactly, not yet, but steady. The kind of voice that didn't rise and didn't fall. "Mr. Walker," she said. He crossed the store in 3 strides and stopped a careful distance away, far enough to give her space she realized, which was a thing so unusual that she almost didn't know what to do with it. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he released her hand before she had time to tense against it. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you arrived," he said. "Axel went on the wagon this morning. Took longer to sort out than it should have." "It's all right. Mrs. Marsh was very kind. Edna's good people." He glanced over at the woman who had gone back to her restocking with the studious focus of someone who was definitely not listening. "You get enough coffee. You eat anything today." Clara blinked. "I'm fine, thank you. There's a place down the street. If you haven't eaten, we should do that before we head out. It's a long ride to the ranch." She nodded. "All right." He picked up her bag before she could reach for it. She opened her mouth to object. She had been carrying her own bag for 10 days. She was perfectly capable of continuing to carry it, and then stopped herself. He wasn't taking it as a power move. He wasn't trying to establish something. He just picked it up the same way he had crossed the room, simply efficiently, without ceremony. "Thank you," she said instead. He nodded once and held the door. The restaurant. A small, warm room with 6 tables and a woman behind the counter, who seemed to know Nate by name, was the kind of place Clara might have loved under different circumstances. The food was plain and hot, and there was more of it than she had eaten in several days because she had been too frightened to eat much on the journey and hadn't had the appetite for it. Nate ordered for them both without asking what she wanted, which she might have resented from anyone else, but he ordered simple things: beef stew, bread, coffee, and he ordered double portions without comment, which she understood was a way of making sure she ate without drawing attention to the fact that she looked like she needed to. She ate. He ate. For a while, they didn't speak much at all, and she was grateful for that too. She was tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with sleep, and the silence felt like a kindness. I should tell you something, he said, finally setting down his spoon. She looked up. When I wrote that advertisement, he said, I was looking for someone to build a life with. I wasn't looking for someone who was already perfect, and I wasn't looking for someone with no past. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her directly. Whatever brought you here, Miss Whitmore, whatever you left behind, or whatever followed you here, that's your business. You don't owe me an explanation. Not today. Her throat tightened. But I want you to understand something, he continued. My home is a place where people are treated with respect. That's not going to change based on who you are or where you came from. If you decide to stay, you'll be treated decently. And if you decide to leave, I'll make sure you have what you need to go somewhere safe. He paused. Either way, I meant what I wrote in that letter. No one is going to hurt you in my house. Clara looked down at her coffee. Her hands were very steady. She had gotten very good at making her hands stay steady, even when the rest of her was shaking somewhere deep inside where no one could see it. You don't even know me, she said quietly. No, he agreed. Not yet, but I know enough. She looked up at him. You survived something, he said simply. That tells me a great deal about who you are. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour on the repaired wagon, and the cold was sharp and clean in a way that Pennsylvania cold never quite managed to be, that flat-wide Montana cold that seemed to come from the sky itself rather than from any particular direction. Nate drove and she sat beside him on the wagon bench, and they talked. Not about important things, not yet, but about practical things. The kind of conversation that needed to happen between two people who were about to share a life without knowing each other at all. The ranch, the cattle, the hired men who worked there. The house, 2 bedrooms, he told her without being asked, and he said it in a tone that made clear he was offering her the larger one and taking the smaller for himself, and he made that clear without making a single thing about it that required her to feel grateful or obligated. She answered his questions honestly, or as honestly as she could manage, without telling him everything she wasn't ready to tell him yet. She told him about the seamstress work she'd done in Pennsylvania, the shop where she'd worked the skills she had sewing, cooking, keeping accounts, ordering supplies. He listened without interrupting and asked follow-up questions that were sharp and specific enough that she understood he was actually paying attention to what she said, not just waiting for his turn to speak. The hired men, she said at one point. How many? 2 full-time. Billy Marsh, Edna's youngest, and a man named Pete Callahan. Good workers, both of them. They stay in the bunkhouse. He glanced at her. You won't be bothered. She nodded. If anyone gives you trouble, he said in exactly the same even tone he used for everything else, you come to me. She nodded again. They rode the rest of the way, mostly in silence, and when the ranch finally came into view, the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the fencing, stretching out into the gray afternoon, Clara looked at it for a long moment. It was not beautiful particularly. It was a working ranch, and it looked like one practical and plain and built to last rather than to impress. But the fences were straight, and the barn roof was solid, and when they pulled up to the house and Nate jumped down and came around to help her, she could see through the front window that someone had lit a lamp inside. It looked like a place where someone lived. She hadn't been in a place like that in a long time. He showed her the house room by room, not the grand tour of a man trying to impress, but the practical walkthrough of someone making sure she knew where things were. The kitchen, the stove, and the wood stacked beside it, the pantry, the water pump, the front room with its 2 chairs beside the fire. The 2 bedrooms, both small, both plain, both clean. This one's yours, he said, opening the door to the larger of the 2. There was a bed with a proper quilt on it, a chest of drawers, a small window facing east. I'll bring in more wood before nightfall. There's a latch on the inside of the door. It's solid. You can check it yourself. She looked at him. The latch, she said carefully. In case you want it, he said without any particular inflection, like it was simply a piece of practical information and nothing more. In case you want it. in case you want to be able to lock the door between yourself and the stranger whose house you are now living in." She felt something shift somewhere deep in her chest. Something that had been wound tight for so long she had forgotten what the tension felt like, until she felt just the very smallest part of it releasing. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He nodded and stepped back from the doorway. "I'll start supper," he said. "If you want to rest first, there's time." He walked back down the hall toward the kitchen, and she heard him moving around in there. The creak of the wood stove door, the soft clink of a pot being lifted, and she stood in the doorway of her new room and pressed her hand against her sternum and breathed. Just breathed. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she breathed in a room with a lockable door in a house where the man on the other side of that door had not made a single demand. She crossed to the door and tested the latch. It was solid, exactly like he said. She did not lock it that night. But she could have. And that was the thing that mattered. Supper was quiet, and simple venison stew and bread coffee, thick enough to stand a spoon in. And they ate at the small kitchen table, while the wind picked up outside and threw itself against the walls of the house. "You don't have to make any decisions right away," Nate told her over the coffee. "About the wedding, about any of it. We agreed to meet. That's all we agreed to." "Most men in your position would expect more than that," she said. It came out more bluntly than she intended, but she was tired, and her guard was lower than usual. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not most men." She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said finally. "I'm beginning to see that." He looked down at his coffee mug, and she thought she saw something flicker across that hard face. Not a smile exactly, but something in the vicinity of one. Something that suggested that beneath the rock-steady exterior and the careful practicality, there was a person who felt things, who had simply gotten very good at not letting those things show. She understood that particular skill very well. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. "What made you place the advertisement?" she asked. "The real reason." A pause. A brief one, the kind a person makes when they're deciding how honest to be with someone they haven't decided to trust yet. "I've been alone on this ranch for 4 years," he said. "I built it to be a home. A home needs more than one person in it to be what it's supposed to be." He set his mug down. "Simple as that, I suppose." She studied his face. "Simple as that," she agreed quietly. Outside, the Montana wind howled and pushed and threw itself against the walls. And inside the house, the lamp burned low and steady, and Clara Whitmore sat across the kitchen table from the stranger she had come to marry, and felt for the very first time, in as long as she could remember, that she might actually sleep tonight. Not because she was safe. She knew better after everything than to believe that quickly, but because the door had a latch, and the man on the other side of it had told her she could use it. And sometimes, when you had been living as long as she had in the particular kind of fear that had no name and no end, sometimes that was enough to let you breathe. She excused herself from the table before long, thanked him for supper, and walked back down the hall to her room. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed, with its clean quilt, and looked at the window and the dark Montana night pressing against the glass. She did not open her bag that night. She would unpack in the morning when things felt a little more real. She pressed her fingers against the bruise on her cheekbone lightly, the way she had done 100 times over the last week, checking, measuring the way you check a wound to know how it's healing. "Those will be the last," she whispered to herself. She wasn't sure yet if she believed it. But she wanted to. She wanted to desperately. She lay down on the bed without undressing, pulled the quilt over herself and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was already aware that the man she had run from would not simply let her go. She had known that even when she was packing the bag, even when she was climbing onto the stagecoach, even when she was staring out the window at the miles of nothing between her and whoever she used to be. He would look for her. He always looked. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, for the very first time in as long as she could remember, she was in a house where the door had a latch, and she had been told that she could use it. The wind kept on outside, pushing and howling at the walls of Walker Ranch. And inside, Clara Whitmore closed her eyes and slept. She woke before dawn, not because of a sound, not because of anything she could name. She woke the way she always woke, all at once, heart already moving fast, body already braced before her mind had fully caught up to where she was. Then she remembered. Montana, Walker Ranch, the room with the clean quilt and the lockable door. She lay still for a moment and listened. The house was quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind had died down from the night before, and somewhere distant, a rooster was making its position on the morning very clearly known. Inside, nothing, just the soft creak of the walls settling against the cold. She exhaled. She sat up, pressed her feet against the floor, and reached for her coat. She was not the kind of woman who could lie in bed past first light. She had tried over the years, she had tried very hard. In fact, in the particular desperate way of someone who understands that sleep is the only mercy available to them, but her body refused it. Years of needing to be awake before everyone else alert, before anyone else moving, before anyone else had a chance to set the terms of the morning. It was a habit that lived in her bones now, and she doubted it would ever fully leave. She pulled on her boots, stood, and reached automatically for the latch before she caught herself. She stopped. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she touched the latch lightly with 2 fingers, not to unlock it, just to feel it there. Solid, just like he said. She unlocked the door and went out into the hall. The kitchen was empty, but the stove had already been fed. She could feel the warmth radiating from it even from the doorway, which meant Nate had been up before her. She crossed to it and found a pot of coffee on the back plate still hot. She poured herself a cup and stood drinking it by the window. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten at the edges, the deep blue of pre-dawn going pale and uncertain around the horizon. She watched it the way she watched most things these days, carefully looking for what she might have missed. "You're an early riser." She turned. Nate was standing in the doorway in his coat and work gloves, having apparently come in from the barn without her hearing him, which bothered her, the not hearing, though she kept that off her face. "Always have been," she said. "Coffee's fresh." He nodded toward the pot. "I found it. Thank you." He crossed to the stove, poured his own cup, and stood on the other side of the kitchen. Not far away, the kitchen was not large enough for far away, but not close either. She was starting to understand that he calibrated distance deliberately, always giving her slightly more room than the space required. She wasn't sure yet whether that was instinct or intention, but either way, it was the right thing. And the fact that he did it without being asked was a thing. She filed carefully away in the back of her mind. "I'll be working the east pasture today," he said. "Billy and Pete are already out. If you need anything, there's supplies in the pantry. Take whatever you want. The horse in the near stall is gentle if you need to ride into town." "I won't need to ride into town," she said. "All right." He drank his coffee. "There's no expectation about what you do today. The house doesn't need to be run on my schedule." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You say that like someone who's had to explain it before," she said. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and quickly controlled. "I say it like someone who means it," he said evenly. She nodded. "All right." He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "I'll be back by midday," he said. "If you cook, I eat whatever's there. If you don't, I cook for myself. There's no rule about it." She almost laughed. It was so practical, so deliberately stripped of expectation, that it was almost funny, except that it wasn't. Not really, because she understood exactly why he was saying these things, and exactly what kind of experience had taught him to say them so clearly. "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped with his hand on the door. "Thank you," she said. "For last night, for the room, for—" She stopped. "For not asking." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't need to thank me for decency," he said. "That's not how it should work." Then he went out, and the door closed behind him, and Clara stood in the kitchen with her coffee and the silence, and felt something in her chest do a complicated thing that she didn't quite have a name for yet. She spent the first morning learning the house. Not because she was lost in it. It wasn't large enough to get lost in, but because learning a space was something she had always done in every place she had ever lived. She learned where the exits were. She learned what sounds carried through the walls and what didn't. She learned which floorboards creaked and which didn't, which windows latched properly and which needed to be pushed down with a firm hand. These were not the habits of a woman making herself at home. They were the habits of a woman who understood that knowing the layout of the room she was in might at any given moment be the difference between safety and something else. But as the morning went on, and the house stayed quiet, and no one came to the door, and the only sounds were the wind outside and her own footsteps on the wood floors, something in her began to relax, not fully, not by a long way, but around the edges. The tight, vigilant readiness she had carried for so long started to loosen just slightly, the way a fist loosens when nothing strikes. She found the pantry well stocked. She found a box of sewing supplies in the back of the front room, closet needles, thread, a few scraps of fabric, and she ran her fingers over them, absently feeling the familiar texture of the materials she had worked with since she was a girl. She cooked, not because she felt obligated to, but because cooking was the other thing her hands knew how to do, and it was something to put herself into. She made soup from the dried beans and smoked meat in the pantry cornbread in the cast iron, and she kept herself moving and busy, because busy was better than still, and still was when the thoughts found her. Nate came in at midday, exactly stomping his boots at the door, and stopped when he came into the kitchen. He looked at the pot on the stove. He looked at the cornbread cooling on the rack. He looked at her. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He washed his hands at the pump, sat down at the table, and ate without fanfare, but thoroughly, and with the focused appreciation of a man who had been eating his own cooking for 4 years. When he finished, he looked up. "That's the best thing I've eaten in a long time," he said. It was a simple thing, a plain, direct thing, but she felt it land somewhere deeper than it should have. "Good," she said. And she turned back to the stove before he could see her face. Billy Marsh came to meet her that afternoon. He was younger than she expected Edna's son, she remembered, which meant he was probably 20 or close to it, with his mother's round face and something of her sharp eyes, though softer in him, less studied. He knocked at the back door of the kitchen, like he'd been told to knock rather than walk straight in, and when she opened it, he took his hat off immediately. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "I'm Billy Marsh. I work the ranch." "I know who you are," she said. "Mrs. Marsh mentioned you." He grinned. It was a good grin, uncomplicated. "Ma talks about everything to everyone, so that's not surprising." He held out his hat in front of him, turning it in his hands the way nervous young men did. "I just wanted to say welcome. On behalf of me and Pete both. We're real glad Nate's got some company. He's been—" He stopped. "Well, he's just been alone too long is all." She leaned against the doorframe and studied him for a moment. "He seems like a man who chose to be alone," she said carefully. "Yes, ma'am. Choosing it and needing it are different things." Billy shrugged. "That's what my ma says anyway." She almost smiled. "Your mother seems like a wise woman." "She thinks so too." He put his hat back on. "Anyway, welcome, ma'am. If you need anything wood split, something hauled, anything at all, you just holler. Pete's shy, but he'll show up if I tell him to." He turned to go. "Billy," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to say that." He grinned again, that easy, uncomplicated grin, and tipped his hat and went back across the yard. She watched him go and thought about what he'd said. He's just been alone too long. She wondered what story Nate Walker carried under that quiet, rock-steady exterior. She wondered what had happened in the 4 years between the war and the ranch and the advertisement in the Pennsylvania paper that had somehow led to her standing in his kitchen doorway in Montana. She wondered, and then she stopped wondering, because wondering about other people's pain was a luxury she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. She had enough of her own to manage. The first week passed, the way new things do slowly at first, and then, in a rush, each day folding into the next before she'd quite finished processing the one before. She and Nate built their mornings around each other without ever explicitly discussing how to do it. A small unconscious choreography of two people learning to share a space. He was up first always and had the stove going before she came out. She made coffee and started breakfast while he did the first round of morning chores. They ate together at the kitchen table and talked about practical things, what needed doing, what supplies were running low, what the weather was supposed to do, and the conversation was easy, in the way that conversations between working people were easy, grounded in shared tasks, rather than the effortful performance of getting to know each other. She started to learn him, not the way she had learned the men in her past defensively cataloging moods and warning signs, and the particular quality of a silence that meant something was about to happen. She learned Nate Walker the way you learned someone you were beginning cautiously to trust. She learned that he was methodical about the ranch in a way that bordered on mathematical. Everything had its order, its logic, its reason. She learned that he was generous with Billy and Pete in a quiet, unshowy way, checking their work carefully, but never humiliating them, giving praise when it was due and correction when it was needed without mixing the two together. She learned that he read in the evenings. This surprised her more than it probably should have. He sat in the chair by the fire after supper, a book open in his hands, reading with the focused, slightly frowning concentration of a man who took whatever he did seriously, and he looked up when she came into the front room and moved the other chair slightly just enough without comment so that it was angled toward the light rather than away from it. She sat in the chair and sewed. They didn't talk much in the evenings in those early days, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words, which was in Clara's experience one of the rarest and most valuable things one person could offer another. On the fifth evening, he looked up from his book and said, "You don't have to stay in here, you know, if you'd rather be in your room." "I know," she said without looking up from her sewing. A pause. "I'd rather be here," she added. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his book. But she saw it again, that almost smile, that flicker of something human moving quickly across the surface of that controlled face. She looked back down at her sewing. And something in her chest did that complicated thing again, the thing without a name. Then came the morning. Everything shifted. It was the 9th day. She knew it was the 9th because she had been counting the way she had always counted days in unfamiliar places, a habit like all her habits born of necessity. Knowing exactly where you were in time was part of knowing exactly where you were in everything else. She was at the pump in the kitchen when she heard the raised voice outside. It stopped her completely. Not because raised voices were unusual in the world she had spent enough years in proximity to them to know they were common, but because there was something in the particular quality of this one that landed on a frequency her body recognized before her mind caught up. Anger. The specific pitch of a man's anger when it was being directed at someone who couldn't easily fight back. She crossed to the window. In the yard, Billy Marsh was standing with his back very straight and his jaw tight, and facing him was a man she had never seen before. Heavy-set, red-faced, with the kind of look on him that came from too much whiskey and not enough remorse. He had his finger pointed at Billy's chest, not quite touching, but close the way men did when they wanted to threaten without leaving a mark. She couldn't hear the words clearly through the glass, but she could hear the tone. She was already moving toward the door before she'd made the conscious decision to move. She came out the back and crossed the yard in quick, even strides. The man didn't hear her coming. He was too focused on Billy, and she came up and stopped just at the edge of the conversation and said clearly, "Is there a problem here?" Both men turned. Billy's expression shifted immediately. The tightness in his jaw loosened with something that looked like relief. The stranger looked at her the way strangers sometimes looked at women who interrupted them, surprised and already annoyed about it. "This is ranch business, ma'am," he said. His tone had the particular edge of a man who expected that to end the conversation. "This is Walker Ranch," she said in exactly the same tone. "So unless you work here, it's not your business." His eyes moved over her. She had become very expert at reading that particular kind of look, calculating, assessing, filing her away as either an obstacle or an irrelevance. He had apparently decided on irrelevance. "I got a dispute with Walker," he said, turning back to Billy. "A business matter. And this boy—" "I'm not your messenger," Billy said, and his voice was steady, but she could see his hands were fists at his sides. "Then I'll wait for Walker himself," the man said, and he folded his arms and planted his feet like a man who had decided he wasn't going anywhere. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Then you'll wait out front," she said. "Not in the yard." He blinked. "Excuse me. You're welcome to wait for Mr. Walker," she said in the calm, level voice she had learned to use in place of the fear. "But you'll do it out front of the house, not back here making my ranch hand uncomfortable in his own workspace." She held his gaze without flinching. "That's not a request, sir." The man stared at her. Billy was staring at her too, though with an entirely different expression. The stranger opened his mouth, closed it again, and then, with the slightly stunned look of a man who had just been outmaneuvered by someone he had already dismissed, he turned and walked around the side of the house toward the front. The moment he was out of sight, Billy let out a long, slow breath. "Lord Almighty," he said softly. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at her with something approaching awe. "He's been coming around twice this month trying to get Nate to sell off the east pasture. Nate's told him no twice. He thought maybe he could get to Nate through—" He stopped. He was saying some things. What kind of things? Billy looked uncomfortable. About Nate. About him being soft. About how the ranch wasn't run properly, and the hands didn't know their place. He glanced at her, and then away. "He said some things about you too. About Nate sending off for a wife like ordering goods from a catalog. Said it was a sign of weakness." She absorbed that. "What's his name?" she asked. "Crawford. Frank Crawford. He runs the Double C spread about 15 miles north." She nodded once, filed it away. "Go back to your work," she told Billy. "I'll speak to Nate when he comes in." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated. "Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. "I'm real glad you're here," he said simply. She didn't quite know what to do with that, so she nodded again and went back inside. Bid. Nate came in at midday, and she told him about Crawford immediately, directly, without editorializing. She told him what she had seen, what had been said, and what she had done. She watched his face as she spoke the way she always watched faces for the shift, the tightening the signal. His expression didn't change. He listened to everything she said, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told him to wait out front," he said. "Yes." "And he went?" "Yes." A pause. "All right," he said. "He wasn't here when you came in." "No, he'd gone by the time I rode up." He sat down at the table. "Crawford's been pushing on the east pasture boundary for 2 years. He's the kind of man who mistakes patience for weakness." "I noticed," she said. Nate looked at her. Then a look she was starting to recognize, the look he got when something she did or said surprised him. Which was she was finding rather more often than she might have expected. "Thank you," he said, "for handling it." "I didn't do it to be helpful," she said honestly. "I did it because someone needed to." He was quiet for a beat. "That's a better reason," he said. 3 days later, Nate asked her to ride into Red Hollow with him for supplies. She said yes, because there was no reason to say no, and because she was tired already of limiting herself based on hypothetical fears. She would have to go into town at some point. Better to go with Nate on her own terms than to have circumstances push her into it when she wasn't ready. The town received her differently this time. She was not this time a woman stepping off a stagecoach alone with bruises on her face and fear in her eyes. She was sitting beside Nathaniel Walker on his supply wagon, and she was wearing her better coat, the gray wool one that fit properly, and she had managed in the days since she arrived to get the worst of the bruising on her face to fade to something less immediately startling. She noticed still the eyes that found her. but they found her differently with curiosity, rather than pity, or perhaps with both in different proportions. Edna Marsh came out of the general store when they pulled up, and there was something deliberate about how quickly she appeared that suggested she had been watching the street. "Clara," she said warmly, which was somehow different from the careful, measured Miss Whitmore of their first meeting, and it registered somewhere. "Mrs. Marsh," Clara said. "Edna," the woman corrected firmly. "Come inside. I have something for you." Nate looked at Clara with the tiniest lift of an eyebrow, the closest she had seen him come to a look of shared amusement, and she followed Edna inside while he dealt with the wagon. What Edna had for her was a bolt of blue wool fabric stored behind the counter that she pressed into Clara's hands with a directness that suggested it was not optional. "For a proper winter dress," Edna said. "What you came in is not enough for a Montana February." "I couldn't. It's last season's stock. It'll sit here until it rots if no one takes it." Edna looked at her. "You can sew, can't you? Nate said you were a seamstress." "I can sew." "Good." The woman folded her arms. "Then take it." Clara looked down at the bolt of blue wool in her hands. It was good quality, better than anything she'd owned in years. "Thank you," she said quietly. Edna's expression softened. "You're doing well out there," she said. "I hear you stood up to Frank Crawford the other day." Clara looked up. News travels fast. "Billy told his mother," Edna said with absolute unapology. "And his mother is me." She tilted her head slightly. "Crawford is not a man who is accustomed to being told what to do by women he doesn't consider important. He won't forget it." "I know," Clara said. "Does that worry you?" She considered the question honestly. "It probably should," she said. "But I've dealt with worse than Frank Crawford." Edna looked at her for a long moment with those sharp, careful eyes. "Yes," the woman said quietly. "I imagine you have." Tad. It was on the way back from town that Nate told her about the war. Not the full story. Not all at once, the way people sometimes unburdened themselves in a great rush when the moment finally opened up. He told it the way he did everything in careful, measured pieces, without sentimentality or drama, in the same even tone he used to talk about cattle prices. He had served for 2 years. He had lost things he didn't name. He had come home to find that what he'd left behind wasn't waiting for him in the form he'd expected. And so he'd come west, and he'd built the ranch from a piece of land and stubbornness, and the particular focused energy of a man who needed to make something good out of the wreckage of everything else. "You lost someone," she said quietly when he paused. He was quiet for a moment. "My brother," he said. "And the woman I was supposed to marry. Not to the war she didn't wait." A pause. "I don't blame her. I was gone 2 years with no guarantee of coming back." Clara looked at his profile against the afternoon sky. "Is that why you placed the advertisement?" she asked. "Because it felt safer than starting from nothing with someone who already knew you." He thought about that for longer than she expected. "Maybe," he said finally. "Or maybe because I wanted someone who was also starting over, someone who understood what it means to build something from scratch." He glanced at her. "Someone who knew that the work was worth it, even when you couldn't see the end of it yet." She held that for a moment. "That's a remarkable thing to put in an advertisement," she said. "I'm a better talker than I am a writer," he said. She laughed. It came out before she could stop it. A real laugh, not the careful, controlled expression of mild amusement she had perfected over years of managing other people's moods. A real one, short and startled, and it surprised her so much that she pressed her fingers against her lips immediately afterward, as if catching it. Nate looked at her. Not surprised exactly, but attentive, the focused attentiveness of a man who understood that he had just seen something real. "Sorry," she said, dropping her hand. "Don't be," he said. They rode in silence for a moment. "I haven't done that in a while," she admitted. Laughed. "Like that," she said. "Like I meant it." He was quiet. Then, "You can, Whenever you want. The laugh, you mean. She looked down at her hands in her lap. She didn't say anything to that, but she kept the words somewhere careful, the way you kept things that mattered, in a place where they couldn't get damaged. Duh. That night was the first time she told him something real. Not everything. Not nearly everything, but something. They were sitting in the front room after supper. Him with his book, her with her sewing, and the fire was burning low, and the wind had come back up outside, and she had been quieter than usual all evening, and he hadn't pushed on it. Just let her be quiet, the way he let her be everything. With the patient, undemanding steadiness that she was starting to understand was simply who he was. She set down her sewing. "His name was Gerald Ashworth," she said. Nate looked up. "He was my father's business partner," she said. "When my father died, there was debt. Gerald offered to take care of it. In exchange for—" She stopped, started again. "He called it looking after me. He called it his responsibility." Nate's book was closed now, though she hadn't seen him close it. "He was 30 years older than me," she said. "I was 17 when my father died. Gerald was 48. She kept her eyes on her hands in her lap. He never formally took me as his wife. He was married. His wife lived in the house too." She pressed her lips together. She knew. She let it happen because she didn't have a choice either. The fire crackled. "I stayed 5 years," she said, "because I had nowhere to go and no money and no way to leave without his knowing. And then—" She stopped for a long breath. "And then I found the advertisement. In a newspaper someone had left at the shop where I worked. And I wrote to you. And I left before dawn on a Monday morning while Gerald was still sleeping." The room was very quiet. She looked up finally because the not looking had started to feel more frightening than the looking, and she met Nate's eyes. His face was very still. But his hands, she noticed, were closed carefully around the edge of the book, the knuckles pressed white. "The bruises," he said. His voice was the same even tone, but something underneath it had shifted, something tightly controlled, like a current running under still water. "Not always," she said. "Only when he was—" She didn't finish. Nate nodded. His jaw was set. "He knows where you went?" he asked. "He might." She looked at her hands. "I didn't tell anyone where I was going, but Gerald has resources, and he doesn't give up what he thinks belongs to him." The word belongs landed in the room and sat there. Nate set the book down on the table beside his chair. He stood cross to the fireplace and stood with his back to her for a moment. She watched the set of his shoulders, the tension in them, the deliberate, careful way he was holding himself still. Then he turned. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "You don't belong to anyone," he said. "Not to him, not to your past, not to—" He stopped. "Not to me. You came here as a free woman, and you'll leave as a free woman if that's what you decide. What Gerald Ashworth thinks he owns is a story he told himself, not the truth." Her throat was very tight. "He won't see it that way," she said. "I know," Nate said. "But what he sees isn't what's real." He held her gaze. "And if he comes here, if he finds you here, he will find that this is not Pennsylvania. And I am not a man who stands aside." She looked at him for a long moment. "You can't promise that nothing will happen," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can promise that you won't face it alone." She looked at him. This man she had known for 9 days, this quiet stranger with the hard face and the gray eyes and the book he closed when she spoke, and she felt something shift inside her with a weight and a finality that frightened her almost as much as everything else. Because she believed him, and believing someone really believing them in the deep, unguarded place where belief actually lived was the most dangerous thing she had done in years. She looked back down at her sewing. "All right," she said softly. It was not agreement exactly. It was not trust exactly. But it was the first step toward both of those things, and they both understood that, without it needing to be said. The fire burned lower. Outside, the Montana wind kept on doing what it always did, pushing, testing, finding the edges of things. And inside, Clara Whitmore picked up her sewing again, and Nathaniel Walker picked up his book, and neither of them spoke again that evening. But the silence between them had changed. It was fuller now. It had weight. It had the particular quality of a silence shared between two people who had just let each other see something real and survived the seeing. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was bad before she even opened it. She knew it the way she had always known things that were bad in her body. First, the cold that moved through her chest, that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The envelope was addressed to her in a handwriting she recognized from across the room, and when Billy handed it to her at the door with his easy smile and said the postmaster had sent it over from town, she took it from him with a steady hand and thanked him and closed the door before she let herself look at it properly. She stood in the front room and looked at it for a long time without opening it. Gerald's handwriting. Careful controlled the handwriting of a man who wanted you to know that everything he did was deliberate. Even the letters she had learned over 5 years were a form of control. He wrote to you when he wanted you to understand that he knew where you were. She opened it. Clara, I know where you have gone. I want you to understand that what you have done reflects not only on yourself, but on everything I have given you over the years. I am a patient man. I have always been a patient man with you. But patience has its limits, and you have now reached mine. I will be coming to Montana. I will be coming to speak to this man you have attached yourself to, and I will be bringing with me documentation that makes very clear what your situation was before you left Pennsylvania. I think you will find that a Montana cattle rancher has very little interest in a woman with your history once the full picture has been presented to him. You should come home, Clara. You should come home before this becomes something that cannot be resolved quietly. G.A. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands and stood very still in the middle of the front room and breathed through the wave of cold that was moving through her. He was coming. She had known in the part of herself that she kept carefully walled off from hope, that this was always a possibility. Gerald did not let go of things. That was the central fact of his character. The truth underneath everything else about him, he did not let go of what he considered his. She had known when she left somewhere beneath the terror and the desperate forward motion of leaving that he would come after her eventually. She had just hoped eventually would be longer than this. The door opened, and Nate came in from the morning's work, and he read her face in the 3 seconds between the door opening and him crossing to the hook for his hat. "What happened?" he said. She held out the letter. He took it, read it. His face stayed still, the way it always stayed still, but she saw his eyes move through the words, and she saw what happened in them, a sharp, quick ignition of something that he brought back under control before it could show on the surface. He folded it. When he says documentation, Nate said, "What does he mean?" "He means things he made me sign," she said. "Years ago, he was careful. He always made it look like I was making choices." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and didn't try to hide it. "Papers that said I had accepted his support, that I was living in his household voluntarily." "Were you—" "I was 17 when I signed the first one." She looked at him directly. "What do you think?" Nate looked back at her for a moment. "I think a 17-year-old girl who had just lost her father and had no money and nowhere to go didn't have a great deal of choice in the matter," he said. "Gerald would disagree." "Gerald," Nate said quietly, "can disagree all he wants. The question is, what he thinks those papers are going to do when he gets here." "He thinks they'll make you see me as damaged," she said plainly. "As someone with a compromised reputation. Someone a respectable rancher would want nothing to do with." Nate set the letter down on the table. "Is that what you think will happen?" he asked. She looked at him. "I don't know you well enough yet to be certain," she said honestly. "But no, I don't think that's what will happen." He held her gaze for a long beat. "Good," he said, "because it won't." He picked up the letter again and held it for a moment. "I want to show this to Harlan Briggs. He's the county judge in Red Hollow. He should know this man is coming. Gerald will bring his own lawyer, she said. I know. He set the letter down again. But this is Montana, Clara, not Pennsylvania. Gerald Ashworth's paperwork means about as much out here as his opinion of me. He paused. Which is nothing. She looked down at her hands. The cold that had been moving through her was still there, but something else had moved in alongside it. Something steadier, something that had to do with the way he had just said this. Is Montana. Clara, like it was a simple fact and not a promise. I should have told you before, she said. When I first arrived. I should have. You told me when you were ready, he said. That's enough. It's not enough. You have a right to know what might be coming here because of me. Clara, his voice was very even. Whatever is coming here because of you is also coming here because it's wrong. Those are not the same thing. He looked at her steadily. I don't want you to apologize for what was done to you. She pressed her lips together hard. I'm not apologizing for what was done to me, she said, and her voice came out more forcefully than she intended. I'm telling you that Gerald Ashworth is a dangerous man, and he is coming to your ranch, and you deserve to know the full measure of what that means. Nate was quiet. Then tell me, he said. So she did. She told him things she had never said out loud to anyone. Not everything. There were things that lived so deep in the last 5 years that she wasn't sure she had the words for them yet, wasn't sure the words existed. But she told him the shape of it. She told him about the first year which had seemed almost bearable until it didn't. She told him about Gerald's wife Margaret, who had moved through the house like a ghost of the woman she must have been before, who had once pressed a few dollars into Clara's hand in the hallway outside the kitchen, and whispered, "Go," in a voice so hollow that Clara had cried about it later in her room, but she hadn't been able to go, not then. Not without money, not without somewhere to go to. She told him about the men Gerald brought to the house sometimes. Business associates, he called them. She told him what those visits required of her, and she said it in plain words without softening them, because she was tired of softening them, tired of finding the clean, careful version of things that had not been clean or careful at all. Nate did not look away. He did not flinch. He did not make the face that men sometimes made, the face that was supposed to be sympathy, but was really a kind of horrified distance, the face that put the story outside themselves where it couldn't touch them. He sat very still, and he listened to every word, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her on that first day, like she was a fact to be understood, not a spectacle to be managed. When she finished, the room was very quiet. How many people know? He asked. His voice was controlled, but barely. Almost no one, she said. Gerald was very careful about appearances. In town in Pennsylvania, people knew he was my guardian after my father died. They thought he was generous. They thought I was lucky. She smiled, and it was a painful thing. He made sure they thought that. Nate stood up. He crossed to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment, and she watched his shoulders, the precise, careful way he was holding himself. Nate, she said. He turned. His face was still controlled, but his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen in them before, a fierce, quiet thing like a fire that's been built in an enclosed space and has run out of room to spread. I need you to understand something, he said. All right. I am going to handle this carefully, he said. Because you deserve careful. You deserve every move made right and nothing done in a way that could come back on you. He paused. But I need you to also understand that Gerald Ashworth is going to find something very different from what he expects when he gets here. She looked at him. He expects a rancher who can be embarrassed, she said. He's going to find one who can't, Nate said. He rode into Red Hollow that afternoon, and she did not try to go with him, because she understood that some conversations needed to be had between men in a place where the weight of those conversations could be properly applied. She hated that this was still true, that there were rooms she could not enter, and arguments she could not make on her own behalf in a way that would be heard, but understanding the world as it was, and fighting it were two different skills. And she had learned long ago that winning required knowing which one to use and when. She stayed home. She cooked. She sewed the first panels of the blue wool dress that Edna had given her, her hands moving with the focused precision of long practice, and she let the work settle her, the way it always settled her, gave her hands something certain to do, while her mind worked through uncertain things. Billy came to the back door mid-afternoon and asked if she needed wood split. "Please," she said. He set to it without further conversation, and she was grateful for that too, for the simple, uncomplicating presence of someone who asked what you needed and then did it without requiring anything in return. When she heard the wagon returning in the early evening, she put down her sewing and went to the door. Nate came in with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and he looked at her first thing, which she had started to notice he always did, came in and found her with his eyes, before he did anything else, like a man checking that something important was still where he left it. "I spoke with Harlan," he said, and Harlan agrees that whatever papers Ashworth brings with him from Pennsylvania have no legal weight in Montana that can compel you to go anywhere." He set his hat down. "He also said that if Ashworth tries to make any public claim about your character or your situation, there are things that can be said in return that Gerald Ashworth might find considerably less comfortable than he anticipates." She looked at him. "What things?" "The kind of things," Nate said carefully, "that a man who spent 5 years keeping a 17-year-old girl in his household under financial duress might not want said loudly in a county courthouse." Her breath came out slowly. "Gerald has lawyers," she said. "Harlan's been the county judge for 12 years, Nate said. And he's got a memory like a steel trap and a disposition for protecting people who can't protect themselves." He paused. "He's also the kind of man who takes a particular exception to men who prey on young women who have nowhere else to go." She sat down in the kitchen chair. She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at them. "He might still come," she said. "He might," Nate agreed. "Probably will. Men like Gerald Ashworth don't change course easily." He sat down across from her. "But he's coming into a place where he has no power, and he doesn't know that yet." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking the way you asked when you needed to understand something completely. He looked at her steadily. "Because it's right," he said. "That's not enough of an answer," she said. A pause. Something moved across his face, something more unguarded than usual. "Because you came here looking for something honest," he said. "And you deserve to find it." He held her gaze. "And because what Gerald Ashworth did to you, what he's been doing to you, makes me angrier than I've been at anything in a long time. And I am not a man who is comfortable leaving anger unaddressed when there's something that can be done about it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't owe me this," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Ian. Gerald Ashworth arrived in Red Hollow on a Thursday 3 weeks after the letter. He arrived with a lawyer, a thin, pale-faced man from Billings named Holcomb, and he arrived with a leather satchel that Clara imagined was full of the careful, considered paperwork of a man who had spent years building a cage so meticulously that it looked from the outside like a home. She learned he had arrived because Edna Marsh sent Billy to the ranch before noon to tell them. "He's at the hotel," Billy said, breathless from the ride. "Him and a lawyer. He went to the land office first thing this morning asking questions about Walker Ranch." Clara felt the cold move through her chest again. Nate was standing in the kitchen doorway. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "About ownership. About debt." Billy looked between them. He asked whether the ranch had any outstanding claims against it. Nate's jaw tightened. "Does it?" Clara asked quietly. "No," Nate said. "Ranch is clear." He looked at Billy. "Tell your mother thank you, and tell her to keep her ears open." Billy nodded and went. Nate turned to Clara. He's looking for leverage, she said. I know. He won't find any with the ranch. She pressed her hands together in front of her. He'll come here directly next. I know that too, Nate. She looked at him. When he comes, what he's going to say about me, I need you to hear it and not... She stopped, tried again. I need to know that you're not going to make decisions based on what he says about who I am. He looked at her with the direct, unwavering steadiness that she had come to understand was not simply temperament but choice. A man who had decided deliberately and repeatedly to be the same person in every moment, regardless of what the moment demanded. Clara, he said, I have made my decision about who you are. He doesn't get to revise it. She held his gaze. She nodded. Young. Gerald came to the ranch the following morning. She heard the horses before she saw them. 2 horses, which meant him and the lawyer both, and she was standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug when she heard the knock on the front door. Nate was already in the front room. He had been there since dawn, and she understood without it being said that he had positioned himself between her and the door deliberately. She heard the door open. She heard Gerald's voice. It hit her the way it always hit her below the sternum, something that compressed and tightened before she could stop it. 5 years of training. 5 years of her body learning that that particular voice required a particular kind of stillness. She set down the mug. She walked into the front room. Gerald Ashworth was exactly as she remembered him. Heavy-set, well-dressed, the kind of man who had learned early that presentation was power and had never stopped investing in it. He was wearing his good coat, his hat in his hand, and the lawyer Holcomb stood just behind his left shoulder, like a shadow that had learned to carry a satchel. Gerald's eyes found her the moment she came through the doorway. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, he had known she was here, he had come because he knew, but something that she recognized from 5 years of learning to read him. Ownership. The look of a man who had come to collect. Clara, he said. Mr. Ashworth, she said. The name, not Gerald, not the diminutive she had been required to use for 5 years, landed in the room, and she watched him register it. Nate was standing to the left of the door. He hadn't spoken yet, but his presence in the room was a physical thing. The way the presence of a mountain was physical, not aggressive, not loud, simply immovable. Walker, Gerald said, turning to him with the slight adjustment of a man recalibrating. I appreciate you allowing us to... I didn't invite you, Nate said pleasantly. You knocked on my door. There's a difference. He did not extend his hand. Say what you came to say. Gerald's eyes moved briefly to the lawyer, then back. He set his hat on the side table, presuming the way he always presumed, and opened his hands in the expansive, practiced gesture of a reasonable man. Mr. Walker, he said, I'm not here to cause difficulty. I'm here because I'm concerned about the welfare of a young woman who has been in my care for 5 years and who left Pennsylvania in a state of considerable distress without. She left Pennsylvania, Nate said, because she chose to. She was in no condition to make clear choices. She answered an advertisement, Nate said in the same level tone. She wrote letters. She arranged her own travel. She arrived here on her own. That sounds like a woman in very clear condition to me. Gerald's expression shifted. Just slightly the first cracks in the reasonable man presentation. She has a history, Gerald said. There are things about Miss Whitmore's past that I think you deserve to know before... He knows, Clara said. Both men looked at her. She had not planned to speak yet, but the words had simply come clear and clean because she was tired, deeply, irreversibly tired of standing in rooms while men discussed her history like she wasn't in it. He knows everything, she said. I told him. Gerald's expression went very still. Everything, she repeated. She watched it move through him, the realization that the ground he had been planning to pull from beneath her had already been removed. He had come here planning to devastate her with disclosure. She had disclosed everything herself. Clara. His voice changed, softened. The other voice, the one that came out when anger wasn't working. You don't understand what you've done. Coming here like this, making these arrangements, people in Pennsylvania are talking. Your reputation. My reputation, she said, is whatever it is. I'm done managing it to protect yours. The room was very still. Gerald turned to Nate with a sharpness he was no longer bothering to conceal. I have documentation, he said. 5 years of records showing that this woman lived in my household, accepted my financial support, entered into... Mr. Holcomb, Nate said, not looking at Gerald, but at the lawyer. The thin man startled slightly. Yes. How much of what's in that satchel was signed by a woman over the age of 18? Holcomb opened his mouth, closed it. Because the document she signed at 17, Nate continued in exactly the same even tone, in the immediate aftermath of her father's death without independent legal counsel under financial duress, that document is worth considerably less than what Mr. Ashworth appears to think. Judge Briggs told me so himself yesterday. The blood drained from Holcomb's face in a way that told Clara everything she needed to know about what he actually believed the documents were worth. Gerald turned back to Nate, and now the reasonable man presentation was fully gone. You have no idea, he said low and hard, what you're involving yourself in. I know exactly what I'm involving myself in, Nate said. A man who spent 5 years keeping a young woman in his household against her will is now standing in my front room trying to take her back. That's what I'm involved in. He took a step toward Gerald, not threatening, not close, but deliberate. And I'm telling you clearly, she's not going anywhere. She is not your concern. She is, Nate said simply. She is my concern, she is my household, and she is staying in it. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. She met his gaze. For 5 years, she had not been able to meet his gaze without something in her dropping some small internal thing, lowering itself like a flag, acknowledging defeat. It had been so automatic, she had stopped noticing it. Just the thing that happened when Gerald looked at her. This time, nothing dropped. She looked back at him and felt her own face still clear present, and she did not look away. This is not finished, Gerald said. For today, Nate said, it is. He crossed to the door and opened it. Mr. Holcomb, Mr. Ashworth. Holcomb moved first, almost relieved, Clara thought, like a man who had been waiting for permission to leave a bad situation. Gerald stayed still for a moment longer, his eyes on Clara, and she kept meeting his gaze, and she kept not dropping anything. Then he picked up his hat from the side table. You'll regret this, he said to her quietly. No, she said. I don't think I will. He left. Nate closed the door. The room was silent. Clara realized her hands were shaking. Not with fear, she knew what fear felt like, knew it intimately, and this was not that. This was something else. Something that came after the body's delayed accounting for everything the mind had just pushed through. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Are you all right? Nate asked. Yes, she said. And then, no. And then, I don't know. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her and looked at her with that direct, steady attention. You did that, he said. Not me. You looked him in the eye and you didn't move. My hands are shaking, she said. That's not weakness, he said. That's what courage looks like after the fact. Her throat tightened. He'll go to the town, she said. He'll talk to people. He'll say things about me. He might. It'll change how people see me. Some people, Nate said. Not the ones that matter. She looked up at him. How can you be sure? Because I know this town, he said. And because Edna Marsh is in it, and nothing Gerald Ashworth says is going to survive a conversation with Edna Marsh. Despite everything, despite the shaking hands and the tight throat, and the cold that was still working its way through her chest, she almost laughed. That's your strategy, she said. Edna Marsh. She's a formidable woman, he said, and there was something in his voice that was so genuinely respectful and so unexpectedly dry that she did laugh this time, the real laugh, the one that came out before she could catch it. He looked at her when she laughed. the same way he'd looked at her in the wagon on the way back from town that day, like she had shown him something he had been watching for without knowing he was watching for it. She stopped laughing. The space between them felt different than it had a moment ago. Fuller, the way the air felt before weather arrived. "Nate," she said quietly. "Clara," he said. She looked at him and thought about what it meant to trust someone. Truly trust them, not the careful defensive version of trust that she had been managing for years, the kind where you gave just enough to get by while keeping the rest locked somewhere safe. Real trust. The kind that meant believing someone without demanding they prove it first. She had been moving toward it since that first morning. She was very close to the edge of it now. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For all of it." He shook his head slightly. "You don't—" "I know I don't have to," she said, "but I want to." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I see what you've done, what you keep doing." She pressed her hands together in front of her. "I'm not accustomed to being seen clearly by people who still choose to stand beside me after." Something moved in his face, something deep and unguarded. "Get used to it," he said quietly. She held that. She held it the way you held things that felt too important to set down carelessly. "All right," she said. Gerald Ashworth spent 2 days in Red Hollow. She knew this because Billy reported back faithfully, having apparently appointed himself her intelligence network with a dedication that she found both touching and useful. Gerald had gone to the saloon the first evening and spoken loudly about Walker Ranch and about Clara and about the disreputable nature of mail-order arrangements and the kind of woman who entered into them he had been received. Billy reported with some satisfaction, with polite disinterest. He had gone to see Harlan Briggs directly the second morning and presented his documentation. Harlan had apparently read each paper with the slow, methodical attention of a man with all the time in the world, and then had looked up and asked Holcomb when precisely Miss Whitmore had turned 18, and what independent legal counsel had been present for the signing of the second agreement, and whether Mr. Ashworth was aware of the territorial statutes regarding financial coercion of minors in the state of Montana. Holcomb had gone pale again, Billy said, though Billy described it somewhat more colorfully than that. Gerald had left on the Thursday morning stage. He had not come back to the ranch. He had not sent word. Clara stood at the kitchen window the morning Billy brought her this news, and she looked out at the yard and felt the cold in her chest. That particular cold that had lived there since the letter arrived began very slowly to recede. Not gone, not yet, perhaps not ever fully, but less, measurably, undeniably less. She heard Nate come in behind her. "He's gone," she said. "I know," he said. She turned. He was standing in the doorway in his coat, his hat in his hand, watching her with that steady, careful attention. "He'll be back," she said. "Maybe not soon, but eventually." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe he decides the cost of coming back is too high." He paused. Men like Gerald Ashworth don't generally persist when the situation stops being in their favor. He's persistent. "He's a bully," Nate said plainly. "Bullies are persistent when there's no resistance. When there's resistance, they look for easier targets." She looked at him. "You think I'm resistance enough?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you were always resistance enough. You just didn't have the space to use it." She absorbed that. She turned it over. She thought about the girl who had signed the papers at 17. The girl who had stayed for 5 years because she couldn't see a way out that didn't end badly. The girl who had finally packed a bag and left before dawn on a Monday morning. She thought about the woman who had told Frank Crawford to move to the front of the house, who had walked into that front room and looked Gerald in the eye and said he knows everything without her voice breaking once. She thought about what Nate had said. "You were always resistance enough." "I need to ask you something," she said. He waited. "When you placed that advertisement," she said, "what were you actually hoping for?" He was quiet for a moment. "Someone to stand beside," he said finally. "Not in front of and not behind. Beside." She looked at him for a long time, The front room was full of the particular morning light of a Montana winter day, and it fell on his face in a way that showed the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw, and the gray of those steady eyes, and she thought that this man was not handsome in any conventional sense, and she did not care about that at all. She thought about what it meant to be beside someone. She had been alone in every room she had occupied for 5 years, not physically, but in the way that mattered. She had been the only person in those rooms who was entirely on her own side, and she had spent so long managing that solitude that she had stopped knowing what it felt like to have company in it. She was beginning to remember. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to stay." Nate looked at her. Something in his face shifted, subtle, careful, but real. "Here," he said. "On the ranch." "Here," she said. "Yes. And—" She stopped, breathed. "And I think I would like to marry you, if you still want that." The room was very quiet. "I still want that," he said. His voice was even as always, but underneath it something moved that she was beginning to know how to hear the current under the still water. "I can't promise I'll be easy," she said. "I have things I'm still carrying. Things that are going to take time." "I know that," he said. "I'll have bad nights," she said. "Mornings where—" "Clara." His voice was gentle. "I know." She stopped. He held her gaze. "I'm not looking for easy," he said. "I'm looking for real." She pressed her lips together. Her hands were not shaking this time. "Then you found it," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment, this hard-faced, steady man who had come into the front room before dawn and stood between her and the door without being asked, and she saw something in his face that she recognized because she had been trying not to name it for weeks. "All right then," he said, and in Walker Ranch on a gray Montana Thursday, with the wind doing what it always did outside, and the fire burning low in the front room, and Billy Marsh somewhere out in the yard splitting wood with more energy than the task required. Nathaniel Walker and Clara Whitmore stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at each other. Not with the careful managed distance of two strangers sharing a house, with the particular terrifying, irreversible openness of two people who had just decided to stop being careful. "All right then," she echoed. And something that had been wound tight in her chest for 5 years longer, maybe longer than 5 years, maybe since she was 17 years old, and her father died, and the world closed around her like a fist released. Not everything. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to begin. The engagement was not announced so much as understood. There was no formal declaration, no public moment in the middle of Red Hollow's main street, with witnesses and ceremony. It was simply that the morning after Clara had said, "I think I would like to marry you," Nate walked into the general store and told Edna Marsh that they had decided, and Edna told 4 people before noon. And by supper time, the entire town knew in the particular way that small towns know things completely thoroughly, and with considerable editorial opinion attached. Clara found out the town knew when Billy came to the back door the following morning wearing a grin so wide it barely fit on his face. "Ma says congratulations," he said, "and she says she's making the cake. She didn't ask, she just said." Clara looked at him. "Is there any world in which your mother asks rather than tells?" "Not one I've ever seen," Billy said cheerfully, and went back to his work. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he left, and she thought about what it meant that people were saying congratulations, that the word was being used, that the thing she had agreed to in the kitchen doorway, the terrifying, irreversible thing, was now a fact in the world that other people could see and name and bake cakes about. She had expected to feel more afraid than she did. She felt something certainly, a tightness in her chest, a vigilance at the edges of her thinking. But underneath it, steady and insistent as a heartbeat, something else. Something that had been trying to come through for weeks and was only now finding enough space to fully arrive. She thought the word for it might be hope. She was still not entirely sure she trusted it. Hope had betrayed her before more than once, and she had learned the hard way to keep it at a careful distance. But this felt different. Not the desperate clinging hope of someone with no other options, but something quieter and more grounded. The hope of someone who had looked at a situation clearly and found actual reasons to believe. Nate had given her reasons. That was the thing. He kept giving her reasons without seeming to know that's what he was doing. 3 days after Gerald Ashworth left Red Hollow on the morning stage, a woman came to Walker Ranch that Clara had never seen before. She arrived on horseback alone in the mid-morning, and she sat in the saddle with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding since before she could walk. She was perhaps 40, lean and weathered with dark hair shot through with gray, and eyes that were the particular shade of brown that looked almost black in certain lights. She wore a man's coat over a woman's dress, and she rode straight to the front of the house and called out without dismounting. "Hello, the house." Clara came to the door. Nate was in the east pasture, and Billy was with him and Pete Callahan, who was, as Billy had promised, shy to the point of near invisibility, was somewhere in the barn. "Can I help you?" Clara asked from the doorway. The woman looked at her with an assessment that was direct without being unkind. "You're the woman who answered Nate Walker's advertisement," she said. It was not a question. "Clara Whitmore," Clara confirmed. "Who are you?" "Ruth Callahan," the woman said. "Pete's mother." She swung down from the saddle with an economy of motion that Clara envied. "I heard what happened with the man from Pennsylvania. I wanted to come by." Clara stepped back from the door. "Come in." Ruth Callahan came inside and looked around the front room the way someone looked at a place they'd been thinking about and were now comparing to the image in their head. "Nate's kept this place tidy," she said almost to herself. Then to Clara, "It looks better with someone living in it properly." Clara brought coffee without asking, because Ruth Callahan was clearly the kind of woman who drank coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table. "What do you know about what happened?" Clara asked directly. Ruth wrapped her hands around the mug. "I know a man came from Pennsylvania claiming you belonged to him," she said. "I know Nate stood him down, and Harlan Briggs helped send him off." She looked at Clara. "I know you stood there and looked the man in the eye." "Billy talks to Pete," Clara said. "Pete talks to me," Ruth said. "Eventually." The corner of her mouth moved. "It takes some work, but he gets there." She looked at Clara with that direct, assessing gaze. "I came because I wanted to see you for myself. Pete's been working this ranch for 2 years. Nate Walker is a good man. I wanted to know what kind of woman was going to be running the household he built." Clara held her gaze. "And—" Ruth Callahan looked at her for a long moment. "The kind who stands her ground," she said. "That'll do." She drank her coffee. Clara almost smiled. "That's your entire evaluation." "I'm a straightforward woman," Ruth said. "Straightforward people don't need much more than that." She set her mug down. "I wanted to say something else too." "All right, what that man did to you," Ruth said plainly, without softening it. "That's not a thing that just goes away because he left. You know that. And there'll be days when it all comes back up on you. And those days are hard, and sometimes the people around you don't know what to do with hard days." She looked at Clara steadily. "Nate Walker is a good man, but he's still a man who's been alone for 4 years, and he doesn't always know what to do with things that can't be fixed by working harder." Clara was very still. "What are you telling me?" she asked. "I'm telling you that if you need someone who isn't him," Ruth said, "I'm 20 minutes ride north of here, and Pete knows the way. And I am not a woman who finds difficulty inconvenient." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at this woman she had met 20 minutes ago, who had ridden 20 minutes on horseback to sit at her table and say this, and felt something shift in her throat. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was carefully steady. "Don't thank me," Ruth said. "Just remember the offer." She finished her coffee, refused more, and left the same way she arrived, directly without ceremony, with the purposeful ease of a woman who had things to do and had done the thing she came to do. Clara stood at the door and watched her ride out and held what had just happened carefully, the way you held things that mattered. She was beginning to understand something about this place. about Red Hollow, about the people in it, about the particular way community worked out here at the edge of everything, not softly, not with a great deal of sentiment, but solidly, practically, with the specific warmth of people who understood that winter was real and distance was real, and you survived both better if you showed up for each other. She had not expected to find that. She had come here looking for safety. She was finding something larger. Nate came in at midday, and she told him about Ruth Callahan. He listened with the focused attention he gave everything, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Ruth's a good woman," he said. "She's had a hard run of it herself. Lost her husband about 6 years back, kept the homestead and raised Pete alone." "I liked her," Clara said. "Most people do once they get past the part where she tells them exactly what she thinks without asking if they want to hear it." Clara looked at him. "You say that like it's a flaw." "No," he said. "I say it like it's a thing that takes some getting used to." He poured his coffee. "Did she scare you?" "A little," Clara admitted. "But the good kind. The kind that means someone is taking you seriously." He looked at her over the rim of his mug with that expression she had started to love, the one that said she had said something that surprised him in a way he found he didn't mind at all. "The good kind," he repeated. "Yes," she said simply. He drank his coffee. "There's something I want to talk to you about," he said. She looked up. "The ranch," he said. "The way it's run." He set down his mug and turned it in his hands, the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts into their proper order. "Right now I handle the accounts and the supply orders and the correspondence with buyers. Billy handles the day work, Pete handles the stock. It works because I have eyes on everything." He paused. "But I've been thinking that if you're going to be here, really here, not just in the house, but in the operation of this place, then the accounts should be yours." She stared at him. "The accounts." "The books," he confirmed. "Inventory supply costs what we spend and what we bring in. You handled accounts at the shop in Pennsylvania, you said." "I did, but—" "Then you're more qualified than I am in some ways," he said. "I can run cattle. I'm less careful with numbers than I should be." He met her eyes. "I want you to be a part of running this place, not just the house, the ranch." She was very still. She thought about what it meant, what he was actually offering, not just a role, not just a task, but a stake, a real one. The kind of stake that couldn't be taken away because it was built into the operation of the thing itself. "You'd trust me with that?" she asked. "I trust you with everything I have," he said. It came out simple and unadorned, the way he said everything that mattered without framing or preamble, just the fact of it placed directly on the table. Her throat tightened. "Nate," she said, "I have to ask you something." "All right. Do you love me?" She watched his face carefully when she said it. "Not, I don't mean it as a demand. I mean it as a real question, because I need to know what this is, what it's becoming. I need to know if you're—" She stopped, tried again. "I've been told things before that weren't true. Important things said with great certainty that turned out to mean nothing at all. And I'm not accusing you of that. But I need to ask directly, because I've learned that not asking directly is how you end up somewhere you didn't mean to be." The kitchen was very quiet. Nate looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know yet if what I feel is what the word love means to other people," he said slowly. "I haven't had much practice with it. What I know is that I think about you when you're not in the room. That your opinion on things matters to me in a way nobody's opinion has mattered in a long time. That when Gerald Ashworth stood in my front room and looked at you the way he looked at you, I had to work harder to stay in control of myself than I have in years." He paused. "I know that I want to be the kind of man you can depend on, and that wanting that as badly as I do is something new." He held her gaze. "Is that love I think it might be getting there?" She looked at him. She thought about all the things she had been told over the years about love, about what it was, what it looked like, what it required of you. Most of those definitions had been used as weapons. What Nate had just described did not sound like a weapon. It sounded like a foundation. I think it might be getting there for me, too, she said quietly. Something in his face opened just slightly, just briefly, and she saw underneath the rock-steady exterior and the controlled expression to something that was very human and very unguarded, and that she thought had probably not been visible to anyone in a very long time. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He had never touched her without her initiating it first. She understood that this was deliberate, that he had been waiting carefully and without pressure for her to set the terms of whatever closeness was possible between them. She turned her hand over under his. They sat like that for a moment at the kitchen table, in the particular silence of two people who have just said something real and are letting it settle. Then she said, "Show me the books." And he laughed a real laugh, short and startled and genuine, and she felt it like a gift. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the ones before. Not easier exactly. The work of the ranch was constant, and the Montana winter was intensifying, and there were days when the cold came inside in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Days when something would happen, a sound or a particular quality of light, or simply a moment of being alone in a quiet room, and everything she had been carrying would come back up all at once with a force that knocked the breath out of her. On those days, she went to the barn. She did not know why the barn specifically, except that it was full of sound and activity and animals who wanted things from her that were simple and uncomplicated. Warmth, feed the occasional reassurance that came from a hand placed firmly on a flank. She found the horses particularly useful for this. They were not interested in her history or her future or the complicated architecture of what she was building with the man in the house. They were interested in whether she had brought anything to eat and whether the person next to them was someone to be trusted. She became, over those weeks, someone they trusted. Nate found her in the barn one afternoon. On one of the harder days, she heard him come in, heard him stop, heard the particular quality of his silence that meant he was reading the situation before he decided how to enter it. "You don't have to stay," she said without turning around. She was running her hand along the neck of the bay mare, who was pressing into her palm with the uncomplicated gratitude of a horse being paid attention to. "I know," he said. He came and stood beside her, not close, not far, in that careful, calibrated way of his, and looked at the horse for a moment. "Bad day," she said. "I could see that," he said. "From the house." She glanced at him. "You could see it from the house." "You walk differently on bad days," he said. "Tighter through the shoulders. Your head is down more." She looked back at the horse. "You've been watching me that carefully," she said. "Not in a watching way," he said. "In a you matter, so I notice things about you way." He glanced at her. "Is that unsettling?" She considered it. "No," she said. "It's strange. I'm not used to it, but no." He nodded, stood with her for a moment. "Do you want to talk?" he asked. "Not today," she said. "All right." He stood with her anyway. Not talking, not filling the space. Just being present in it the way you were present for someone who needed company more than they needed conversation. They stood together in the barn until the mare got bored with being attended to and turned away, and then Clara took a breath and straightened her shoulders and said, "I'm all right." "I know," he said, not dismissively, with the particular certainty of someone who meant it. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because you keep getting up," he said simply. "That's how I know, Watson." 6 weeks before the wedding, the second letter arrived. She knew before she opened it that it was not from Gerald. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, a woman's hand, thin and slightly uneven in the way of someone writing under physical difficulty. The postmark was Pennsylvania. She opened it at the kitchen table while Nate was outside, because whatever it was, she wanted to read it alone first. "Dear Miss Whitmore, you do not know me, though I believe you know of me. My name is Margaret Ashworth. I am Gerald's wife. I want you to know that I am glad you left. I have been glad since the morning I realized you were gone. I did not help you when I should have, and I have not forgiven myself for that. The $2 I put in your hand in the hallway was not enough. It was never enough, I know that. I am writing because Gerald has returned to Pennsylvania in a considerable temper and has been speaking to people about what happened in Montana. He is saying that you embarrassed him, that the rancher you attached yourself to made a fool of him in front of the county judge. He is angry, but I have seen him angry before, and this is a different kind, the kind that comes from someone who knows for the first time that they have lost. I believe he will not go back. I believe the man in Montana showed him something he was not prepared for, and Gerald, whatever else he is not stupid. He recognizes a situation that is turned against him. I want you to be happy, Clara. I know that I have no right to ask anything of you, and I am not asking. I am only telling you that somewhere in Pennsylvania there is a woman who is glad you got out, and who is glad you found someone willing to stand beside you. Please do not write back. It would not be safe for either of us. M.I. Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the table and pressed her hands flat and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed. Margaret. She had thought about Margaret Ashworth over the years, had carried the image of her, the hollow-eyed woman who moved through the house like something that had been drained of its essential substance, with a complicated mixture of resentment and pity, and the specific guilt of someone who survived a situation that someone else did not. She had told herself in her worst moments in Pennsylvania that she was not responsible for Margaret's choices. She had told herself that a great many times with varying degrees of success. But Margaret had pressed $2 into her hand in a hallway and whispered, "Go." That had been its own kind of courage. Small, maybe. Not enough. But present. She heard Nate come in. She turned in her chair. "There's a letter," she said. "You should read it." He came to the table, picked it up, read it. She watched his face move through it. When he finished, he set it down carefully. "She's right," he said. "About Gerald not coming back." "You think so?" "I know men like Gerald Ashworth," he said. "They choose their battles based on what they think they can win. He came here expecting to find an embarrassed woman and an impressionable rancher. He found neither." He looked at her. "He won't come back into a situation where he's already lost. It would cost him too much to look at." She nodded slowly. "She didn't have to write this," Clara said. "No. She took a risk writing it." "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "She must have needed you to know." Clara looked down at the letter. She thought about what it meant to need someone you had failed to know that you were sorry, to reach across the distance of your own culpability and try inadequately to account for it. She understood that impulse. She had felt versions of it herself about other things, other moments where she had stayed still when she should have moved. "I can't write back," she said. She said not to. "No." Nate agreed. "But you can know that she's glad." He paused. "That's something." "It is?" she said quietly. "It's something." She folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment. Then she made a decision. She went to the fireplace in the front room and she put the letter in and she watched it burn because Margaret had asked her not to write back, and this was the best way she knew to ensure the letter could never be found and used against the woman who had written it. She stood there until there was nothing left of it. When she turned around, Nate was standing in the doorway watching her. "All right," he asked. "Yes," she said, and this time she meant it entirely. "I think that part is finished." He nodded once. "Then come have supper," he said. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in April. Edna Marsh made the cake as promised. A proper cake white, and layered that she produced from her kitchen, with the fierce pride of a woman who had decided that this occasion merited her best work. Ruth Callahan rode in from her homestead, with Pete, who had apparently been persuaded into a clean shirt for the occasion, and Billy wore his good coat and stood at the front of the small church, with the proprietary satisfaction of a young man who felt personally responsible for the outcome of a thing he had mostly watched from the sidelines. Clara made her own dress. She had been making it for 2 months, the blue wool from Edna cut and fitted and sewn with the careful precision of her best work. It was not elaborate. It was not a dress that made a spectacle of itself. It was simply a good dress, well made in a blue that was the color of the Montana sky, on the kind of clear day that came without warning in the middle of winter and reminded you that the seasons did change eventually, whatever it felt like in the worst of February. She stood in her room the morning of the wedding and looked at herself in the small mirror on the dresser. The bruises were long gone. She had not thought about them consciously in weeks, had not done the thing she used to do, pressing her fingers against her cheekbone to measure the healing. At some point, the habit had simply stopped, without her noticing the exact moment it left. She looked at her own face. She looked for what was there now, in the place where the bruises used to be, in the space where the fear used to live so close to the surface that anyone paying attention could see it. She found something she had not expected. Her own face. Just her own face without the overlay of everything she had been carrying. Without the vigilance and the management and the careful control. Just Clara Whitmore, 22 years old, in a blue wool dress on an April morning in Montana. She pressed her fingers against her cheek, not checking for bruises, just touching her own face, and the skin was warm and unbroken. "Those will be the last," she had whispered to herself on that first night, pressing against the bruise by the window in the dark. She had not entirely believed it then. She believed it now. She picked up the small bunch of dried wildflowers that Ruth Callahan had brought her that morning, winter preserved, carefully tied with a piece of ribbon, and she walked out of the room. Nate was waiting in the front room in his good coat, his hat in his hand, and he looked up when she came through the doorway. He went still, not the controlled stillness of a man managing his expression. A different kind, the stillness of someone encountering something that stopped them before they could decide how to respond. "Clara," he said. She stood in the doorway and held his gaze. "You look—" He stopped. He was not, she had learned, a man who found words easily when something mattered to him enough. The more something mattered, the quieter he got. "Like myself," she offered. "Yes," he said. "Like yourself. Exactly like yourself." She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and looked up at his face. The hard, weathered face that she had learned like a language over these months had come to read the way you read something you knew by heart. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You've thanked me before," he said. "I've told you." "Not for this morning," she said. "For all of it. For the room with the latch, for the letter from Harlan, for standing in the front room when Gerald came, for the accounts." She paused. "For the space. For giving me enough space to come back to myself." He looked at her. "You came back to yourself," he said. "I was just here." "That's not nothing," she said. "That's everything." Something moved in his face, deep and real and briefly uncontrolled. He lifted his hand and touched her face, her cheek with his fingertips, careful as someone touching something they had been waiting a long time to touch. She leaned into it, not away, not carefully sideways, directly into it. She felt his hand curve against her cheek, and she felt the warmth of it all the way down into the place where the cold had lived for so long, and it was not a dramatic thing. It was not the thing that happened in stories, where the touch transforms everything at once, and the past is simply done. It was quieter than that, more real than that. It was just his hand on her face, warm and steady. It was just her leaning in. But it was enough. It was more than enough. "We should go," she said. "Edna will not forgive us if we're late." "Edna won't forgive us for anything today," he said. "She's invested." Clara did laugh. Then the real laugh, the one that came out before she could catch it. And he smiled. Actually smiled, the full version, the one she had only seen fragments of until now. And she thought that this was the thing she would remember most about this morning. Not the dress, not the church, not the cake. This. Right here. The two of them standing in the front room of Walker Ranch, laughing about Edna Marsh and his hand on her face, and the way the morning light was coming through the windows. This was the moment. She would keep it. The ceremony was short, which suited them both. Harlan Briggs presided because Red Hollow's minister had been down with a winter cold for 2 weeks, and Harlan had the authority, and as he put it, the disposition for making things official. He spoke plainly and without embellishment, and he looked at both of them, with the particular warmth of a man who had played a small part in making the thing possible and felt good about it. Nate said his vows in the same even voice he used for everything steady and unhurried and meant. And Clara heard in them all the things he was not the kind of man to say in elaborate ways, but that came through in the plainness of his words. He was not promising her a story. He was promising her a life. She said hers looking at his face, and she said them without her voice breaking once, and she felt as she said them something she had not expected to feel. She felt free. Not free of the past. She understood by now that the past was not something you got free of, only something you learned to carry differently. But free in the present, in this moment, in this specific room, with these specific people around her. Free to be exactly who she was. The woman who had arrived afraid and wounded. The woman who had stood in her own kitchen doorway and looked Gerald Ashworth in the eye. The woman who kept the accounts. Now the woman who had learned the name of every horse in the barn. The woman who had laughed in a wagon on the way back from town and felt for a moment entirely like herself. Both of those women were true. Both of them were here. When Harlan declared them married, Billy Marsh let out a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a whoop, and Edna told him firmly to behave himself, and Ruth Callahan caught Clara's eye from across the room and gave her a single small nod. The nod of a woman who had ridden 20 minutes on horseback to make an offer of friendship and was now watching the thing she had hoped for actually arrive. Clara nodded back. Nate took her hand. He held it the way he did everything carefully, deliberately, with the specific warmth of a man who understood that what he held mattered. She held his back. Outside, the April wind was doing what the Montana wind always did, pushing and testing, finding the edges of things. But inside the small church in Red Hollow, surrounded by the people who had watched the journey unfold, it was warm, and Clara Whitmore Walker stood in that warmth and held her husband's hand and thought about a woman who had packed one bag and left before dawn on a Monday morning in Pennsylvania, with nothing but fear and a folded letter, and the desperate prayer that something in her life might go the way it was supposed to. She thought about what that woman deserved. She thought about what she had found, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, longer than the 5 years longer than her father's death, maybe longer than she had ever known, she was not waiting for something to go wrong. She was simply here, present, hers, and that was everything. The first summer as Clara Walker was not easy. She had not expected it to be. She had learned over the course of a life that had required her to learn things the hard way, that new chapters did not begin cleanly, that the old pages had a tendency to bleed through their ink still wet, pressing themselves against whatever came next, and leaving marks that took time to fade. She had known this going into it. She had told Nate as much standing in the kitchen doorway that night. She said yes when she told him she couldn't promise easy. What she had not fully anticipated was the specific shape that difficult would take. It came in small ways mostly. A sound, a door closing too hard in the wind, a raised voice from outside, Billy arguing cheerfully with Pete about something inconsequential in the yard, and she would be somewhere else entirely for a moment. Somewhere that smelled like a different house in a different state before she found her way back. She was getting faster at finding her way back. That was the thing. She tracked the metric that mattered, not whether it happened, but how long it took her to return to herself when it did. She was getting faster. But there were harder days too. Days when the returning took longer, when she sat in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug and stared at the wall and waited herself out with the grim patience of a woman who had learned that the wave would crest and break and recede if she just stayed still enough and kept breathing. Nate learned to read those days by the set of her shoulders, as he had told her he did. He learned when to come close and when to give her room and when to simply appear in the same space without making it about him being there, just placing himself in her peripheral vision. Steady and undemanding, the way a landmark was steady, something to orient by without requiring your full attention. He was remarkably good at it. She told him so one evening in late June, when they were sitting in the front room and she had come back from one of the harder days, and he had spent 2 hours reading in his chair without once asking if she was all right. "You're good at this," she said. He looked up from his book. At what? At being present without requiring anything from the presence, she said. Most people don't know how to do that. They need the being there to be acknowledged. They need you to notice that they're making the effort. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it with the seriousness he brought to things worth thinking about. I had a period after the war, he said slowly, when I couldn't tolerate a lot of noise. Not just sound noise, the noise people make when they need things from you. When they need you to be a certain version of yourself so they can be comfortable. He looked at his book without really seeing it. A friend of mine, another soldier man named Cooper, he'd come and sit on my porch some evenings, and we'd just sit there. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't try to talk me back into myself. He just sat there. He paused. That was the thing that actually helped. Eventually. Clara looked at him. Cooper, she said. He died 2 years after the war. Fever. Nate set the book down. But I never forgot what he did. I thought about it a lot afterward. What it meant to help someone without making the help about yourself. She held that. You learned how to do it, she said quietly. I learned what it felt like to need it, he said. Same thing mostly. She looked at her hands. I didn't have a Cooper, she said. I know, he said. That's why it took you longer. She looked up at him. The evening light was doing something particular to the front room coming through the western window at the angle it reached, in July, golden and unhurried. And she looked at his face in it, the hard face she had come to know, like a language, and she thought that the thing she felt in this moment did not need a qualified name anymore. She knew what it was. She had known for a while. Nate, she said. Clara, he said. I love you, she said, plainly. Without build-up or preamble, the way she had learned to say important things directly, and without softening because she had learned what it cost to keep important things soft. He looked at her. Something moved through his face, the full, unguarded version, the one she only caught in moments like this when he wasn't quite prepared enough to manage it into something less visible. I know, he said. And then, after the briefest pause, quietly, I love you too. Not I think I'm getting there. Not the careful hedged version of 2 months ago, just the thing itself, plain and certain and placed directly on the table between them. She felt it land. She felt it settle. She picked up her sewing, and he picked up his book, and the evening continued, in the direction evenings went, and neither of them said anything else about it. They didn't need to. It was said. It was real. It lived in the room now, solid and permanent, the way the furniture was solid and permanent, something you could put weight on. She was very good at knowing the difference between what would hold and what wouldn't. This would hold. In August, a woman named Josephine Tate arrived in Red Hollow. Clara learned about her the way she learned about most things that happened in town through Edna Marsh, who appeared at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with her basket over one arm and the particular expression of a woman carrying significant information. There's a woman at the hotel, Edna said, sitting down at the kitchen table with the proprietary ease of someone who had decided she was welcome there and needed no further invitation. Arrived Monday. Young, maybe 20, traveling alone. She's got a carpet bag and a bruise on her jaw, and she's been asking at the hotel whether there are any ranches in the area looking for domestic help. Clara went very still. Where did she come from? She asked. Nebraska, she says. Edna accepted the coffee Clara poured without comment. Though she doesn't say much else, she eats alone. She sits with her back to the wall. She flinches when the door opens. The silence in the kitchen was a specific kind. Clara set down the coffee pot. Is she safe where she is? For now, Edna said. But she's running low on money, and the hotel isn't a permanent solution, and she doesn't know anyone here. She looked at Clara steadily. I told her I knew someone who might have work for her, someone who would understand her situation. Clara held Edna's gaze. You didn't ask me first, she said. No. Edna agreed. I didn't. Clara looked at her for a moment. What's her name? Josephine. She goes by Joe. Clara nodded. She went to the door and looked out toward the barn. Billy, she called. He appeared at the barn door. Ma'am, ride into town. Tell a woman named Josephine Tate at the hotel that Clara Walker would like to speak with her and bring her back here if she's willing. She paused. Tell her she doesn't have to come if she doesn't want to. Tell her it's her choice. Billy was already moving toward the horses. Yes, ma'am. Edna looked at Clara from the table with an expression that was entirely satisfied and making no effort to hide it. Don't, Clara said. I'm not saying a word, Edna said. You're thinking several. I'm allowed to think. Edna drank her coffee. You're a good woman, Clara Walker. You don't know that yet, Clara said. I might turn her away when she gets here. You won't, Edna said simply. She was right. Josephine Tate arrived at Walker Ranch 2 hours later, sitting beside Billy on the wagon with her carpetbag on her lap and her back very straight, in the way of someone who had decided that posture was the last form of dignity available to them. She was 20, as Edna had said. Small, dark-haired, with quick, careful eyes, and the bruise along her jaw that had gone from purple to green at the edges, a week old, Clara estimated. Maybe 10 days. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at Clara with the particular expression of someone trying to assess danger before committing to a direction. Clara recognized that expression. She had worn it herself, standing outside a stagecoach in the Montana cold less than a year ago. Josephine, she said. Joe, the girl said. Her voice was steady. Good. That steadiness under difficult circumstances was something Clara respected immediately. Come inside, Clara said. Have you eaten today? A pause that answered the question before the words did. I'm fine, Joe said. That wasn't what I asked, Clara said. Come inside. She fed her first. She had learned from her own arrival that everything was harder on an empty stomach, and that a person who had been running couldn't think clearly until the most basic things had been addressed. She put bread and cold meat and the remains of the morning soup on the table, and she sat across from Joe and drank coffee, and didn't say anything, while the girl ate with the focused, slightly embarrassed speed of someone who is very hungry and trying not to show it. When Joe finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at Clara. Mrs. Marsh said you might have work, she said. I might, Clara said. But first I want to hear where you came from and why you're here. Joe's jaw tightened. Mrs. Marsh said, I know what she said, Clara said. I'm asking you directly. Because I know the difference between a woman who's traveling by choice and one who's traveling because she had to, and I need to know which situation I'm actually dealing with before I can tell you what I can offer. Joe looked at her. Something moved in the girl's eyes, a calculation, a weighing the specific assessment of someone deciding whether this was a situation they could afford to be honest in. Clara held her gaze and waited. I left Nebraska 6 weeks ago, Joe said finally. I left because the man I worked for decided that my wages were optional, but my presence wasn't. She said it flatly, without emotion, the way you described something you had processed past the point of immediate pain. I had enough money saved to get this far. I didn't plan Red Hollow specifically. The stage stopped here, and I had enough left for 2 nights at the hotel, and I thought... She stopped. You thought you'd figure out the next part from here, Clara said. Yes. Clara nodded. Is he looking for you? She asked. Probably. Joe's hands tightened on each other. He's the kind who looks. Clara breathed through the echo of that he's the kind who looks and what it meant in the body to say it and hear it said. I know that kind, she said quietly. Joe looked at her. Really looked the way you looked when someone said something that meant they actually understood rather than just approximating understanding. The work is real, Clara said. The ranch needs another set of hands in the house, and I need someone who can help with the accounts and the correspondence. It's not exciting work. It's thorough, and it's detailed, and it requires someone who pays attention. She held Joe's gaze. There's a room, small but private, and it has a solid latch on the inside. The men who work here are decent. My husband is decent. And if anyone comes looking for you, they will find out very quickly that Red Hollow is not a place where that goes the way they expect. Joe was very still. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Clara said. Joe looked at her for a long moment. "How?" she said. "How do you know enough?" Clara looked back at her. "Because you rode to a stranger's house on the word of a woman you met 2 days ago," she said. "Because you sat with your back straight even though you're exhausted and frightened and have been running for 6 weeks. Because when I asked you directly, you told me the truth." She paused. "That tells me enough." Joe's composure, the rigid, careful composure she had been holding since she climbed off the wagon, cracked. Not dramatically, just at the edges. A slight unsteadiness around her eyes. She pressed her lips together and held it. "All right," she said. Her voice was very even. "I'll take the work." "Good," Clara said. "I'll show you the room." Nate came in that evening to find 2 women at the kitchen table, working through the supply ledger. One of them his wife, and one of them a dark-haired girl he had never seen before, who looked up at him with the alert wariness of a creature that had learned to take no one's measure for granted. He looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with an expression that said several things simultaneously and trusted him to understand all of them. He took off his hat. "Evening," he said to the girl. "I'm Nate Walker." "Joe Tate," she said, and she watched him the way Clara had once watched him cataloging, measuring, ready to revise the assessment in either direction, depending on what he did next. He crossed to the stove and poured himself coffee. "You staying on?" he asked without turning around. "If you'll have me," Joe said carefully. "Clara says yes, it's yes," he said. He turned and looked at the girl with the direct, steady regard that Clara had long since stopped finding startling. "The bunkhouse crew is Billy Marsh and Pete Callahan. Billy talks too much and Pete not enough, but they're both good people, and they'll leave you alone if that's what you want." He drank his coffee. "If anyone gives you trouble, you tell Clara or you tell me. Either way, it gets handled." Joe looked at him for a moment. She glanced at Clara. Clara gave her the smallest nod. Yes, he means it exactly as he said it. Joe turned back to Nate. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and took his coffee to the front room, and Clara heard the familiar creak of his chair, and then the room was quiet again in the particular way of Walker Ranch evenings, settled, purposeful, warm. Joe looked at Clara. "He's—" She stopped, apparently unsure of the word. "I know," Clara said. Joe looked at the doorway where Nate had been and back at Clara, and Clara could see the girl doing the same thing she had done in her earliest days here, the recalibrating, the cautious, disbelieving revision of an assumption that the world only contained a certain kind of man. "Does he know?" Joe asked quietly. "About why you came here?" "Everything," Clara said. "And he stayed." "He stayed," Clara confirmed. Joe was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that was possible," she said, not bitterly, just honestly, the way you stated a thing you were in the process of learning. "Neither did I," Clara said, "for a long time." She turned back to the ledger. "Now, the supply accounts. I'll walk you through how I've organized them." Joe picked up her pencil, and they went back to work. The twist that came in September was not the one Clara had been quietly, persistently half expecting, not Gerald returning, not a legal challenge, not any of the external threats she had been holding herself prepared for at the edges of her daily life. It was internal, and it was the kind of thing that changed everything quietly, without announcement, the way the most important things often did. She was sick 3 mornings in a row before she understood what it meant. She sat on the edge of her bed on the 4th morning and held the knowledge inside her and breathed through it and waited to find out what she felt. She had not known until she sat there what she expected to feel. Fear had seemed likely. She had enough history with uncertainty to make fear a reasonable first response to most new things. Or a kind of dissociation, maybe. The specific unreality of a life changing faster than she could fully register. What she actually felt was something she recognized now, because she had been feeling its smaller version for months. Hope. Not the small, cautious kind she had been rationing carefully since January. The full version. The one that takes up real space. She found Nate in the barn. He was checking the harness on the bay mare, working with the methodical precision of a man who kept things in proper order, because he understood that order was a form of respect for the thing being maintained. He heard her come in and looked up, and he saw her face immediately read it in the 2 seconds before she spoke, the way he always read her, and he set down the harness. "Clara," he said, "what's happened?" She looked at him across the barn. "Nothing bad," she said. "I need to make that clear first. Nothing bad." He waited. She pressed her hands flat against her stomach just briefly, and she watched understanding move through his face, slow, and then all at once the way understanding sometimes came. He went very still. "Are you?" he started. "Yes," she said. The silence in the barn was enormous. He crossed to her in 4 strides and stopped directly in front of her, closer than he usually positioned himself, and he looked at her face with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something that was past the controlled exterior entirely, something unmanaged and raw, and so completely human that it almost undid her where she stood. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. He lifted his hands and held her face in both of them carefully, the way he always touched her, like something that mattered being handled with proper attention, and she felt the slight tremor in his hands that she had never felt before, this man who was steady in everything. He was not steady right now. "Nate," she said, "are you all right?" "No," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Yes." He pressed his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. "I don't know." She put her hands over his. "I know," she said softly. "That's how I feel too." They stood like that for a long moment in the barn, foreheads touching his hands, trembling slightly against her face, the bay mare entirely unimpressed and continuing to eat her feed at the back of the stall. When he pulled back to look at her, his eyes were very bright. She had never seen that before either. "Good," he said finally. Just that. The single word that meant everything. "Good," she agreed. "Morag." She told Joe first before anyone else because Joe was at the kitchen table with the accounts when she came back inside, and Joe looked up and read her face with the same quick, careful attention she brought to everything. The attentiveness of a woman who had survived by noticing things, and she said, "What happened?" "You're—" And then she stopped and looked at Clara properly and said, "Oh." "Yes," Clara said. Joe set down her pencil. She looked at Clara for a moment with an expression that Clara did not immediately know how to name, something complicated and layered, something that was glad for Clara and processing its own weight simultaneously. "Are you scared?" Joe asked. "Yes," Clara said honestly. "Good," Joe said, which was such an unexpected answer that Clara almost laughed. Joe seemed to recognize this and explained quietly, "It means it matters enough to be scared of." Clara looked at her. This girl she had known for 3 weeks, who had arrived with a carpet bag and a bruise and a back held very straight, who had turned out to have a mind like a steel trap and a gift for figures, and the specific courage of someone who had been reduced and refused to stay that way. "Joe," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When you left Nebraska," Clara said, "what made you go?" "What was the moment?" Joe was quiet for a beat. "There wasn't a moment," she said. "There was a morning. I woke up and I thought if I stay one more day, I might not be able to leave at all. Not because he'd stop me, because I'd stop myself." She looked at her hands on the table. I thought if I stay, I'll forget I was ever someone worth leaving for. Clara held that. I thought the same thing, she said quietly. Joe looked up. Then we're the same, Joe said. Different details. Same thing. Yes, Clara said. Same thing. Ammo. Edna Marsh cried when Clara told her, which Edna immediately and vigorously denied, and which everyone present, including Edna's own husband, chose to accept without comment, because there were situations in which the kindest thing was to agree with the version of events a person needed to be true. Ruth Callahan rode over the following week and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Clara with those dark eyes and said, "You're going to be a good mother." "You can't know that," Clara said. "No," Ruth agreed. "But I know you're going to try harder than most people do for better reasons than most people have." She paused. "That's usually what it comes down to." Clara looked at her. "Were you scared when you were expecting Pete?" "Terrified," Ruth said without hesitation. "But here's what I learned. The fear doesn't mean you're not ready. It means you understand what it means. The people who aren't scared," she shook her head, "those are the ones I worry about." Clara absorbed that, filed it carefully in the place where she kept things worth keeping. "I need you to tell me something honestly," Clara said. Ruth looked at her steadily. "All right." "The things I carry," Clara said. "The history, the bad nights, the days that come back on me. Will it affect—" She stopped, tried again. "I need to know if what happened to me makes me someone who shouldn't." "Stop," Ruth said. Clara stopped. "What happened to you," Ruth said plainly and firmly, "is not something you did. It is not a character flaw. It is not a disqualification." She held Clara's gaze without yielding. "It is something that was done to you, and you survived it, and you are sitting at this table in a house with a man who loves you, and a girl you pulled in from the cold, and a community that would line up to stand beside you." She paused. "That is not the story of a woman who shouldn't be a mother. That is the story of one who already knows more than most about protecting what matters." Clara's throat was very tight. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Ruth said. "Just believe it." Billy Marsh's reaction was characteristically uncomplicated. He went red in the face, clapped Nate on the shoulder so hard that Nate actually took a half-step sideways, and then looked at Clara with an expression of such genuine, uncomplicated joy that she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was still knotted. "This is the best news I've heard since..." He stopped, apparently unable to find a comparison large enough. "Since ever," he finished. "That's high praise," Clara said. "I mean it entirely," he said. He looked at Nate. "You know what this means." "Several things," Nate said. "It means this ranch is going to have somebody to leave it to," Billy said with the deep satisfaction of someone who had a personal stake in the continuity of a place that had become central to his own life. "That matters. That really matters." Nate looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nate. "It does," Nate said quietly. Pete Callahan, informed by Billy in the barn that evening, said nothing at all for a long moment, and then said, "Good," in a tone that somehow contained more warmth than most people managed with entire paragraphs. Clara, told about this by Joe, who had been informed by Billy, immediately found that she loved Pete Callahan a little bit for it. By the time the first snow came back to Walker Ranch, the household had grown in ways that Clara had not predicted when she packed her one bag in Pennsylvania in the dark before dawn on a Monday morning. Joe Tate had become so integral to the running of the ranch accounts that Clara had taken to describing her to buyers and suppliers as the ranch's bookkeeper, which was a title that made Joe sit up straighter every time it was used, and that Clara deployed deliberately for exactly that reason. Joe still flinched sometimes when doors opened too fast. She still kept her back to walls in unfamiliar places. But she had started laughing at Billy's jokes, which Clara considered significant progress. And she had developed a specific fierce loyalty to Walker Ranch that showed itself not in words, Jo was not a woman who used many words where fewer would do, but in the way she worked, in the care she brought to every task, in the way she would be the last one at the table at night, making sure the numbers balanced before she went to bed. She was healing the same way Clara had healed, not in a straight line, not quickly but steadily, with the grain rather than against it. One evening in late October, Jo came to Clara in the front room and stood in the doorway and said, "I want to tell you something." Clara looked up from her sewing. "All right." "I didn't come here thinking anyone would actually—" Jo stopped, started again. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. I want you to know that it's not that anymore." Clara set down her sewing. "Jo," she said. "It's not nowhere else to go," Jo said firmly, like she needed to say it all the way. "It's where I want to be. There's a difference. I want you to know that I know the difference." Clara looked at this girl, this woman. She corrected herself, because Jo had walked through enough to earn that, and felt something move in her chest that was entirely uncomplicated. "I know you know," she said. Jo nodded once, went back down the hall. Clara picked up her sewing. From the front room she could hear Nate in his chair, the familiar small sound of a page turning, the creak of the wood when he shifted his weight. Outside, the first winter wind was beginning to feel out the edges of the house, testing the way it always did. Inside, the stove was warm, and the lamp was burning, and the house was full of the specific, unspectacular sounds of people living in it. She set down her sewing again. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in this town 11 months ago with a bruised face and a folded letter, and the careful, controlled terror of someone who had learned that the world was not to be trusted with the important parts of herself. She thought about what that woman had walked into. Not a rescue. She understood that clearly now, in a way she hadn't been able to see from inside the earliest days of it. Nate had not saved her. Jo had not been saved by her. The saving was something each of them had done themselves in the specific, difficult daily work of choosing to believe they were worth the effort of continuing. What they had given each other was something different. Space. The particular invaluable gift of enough space to remember who you were before the world had its way with you. Enough steadiness around you that you could afford to stop being so vigilant for a moment and just breathe. Just be present. Just exist without performing survival every second. That was what love looked like, she had come to understand. Not the version she had been shown before, the version that required you to be small enough to fit inside someone else's definition of you. The real version. The one that made you larger. The one that gave you back to yourself. "Clara," Nate's voice from the front room. "Yes," she said. "Come sit with me." She got up. She went into the front room, and she sat in her chair across from his, and she picked up her sewing, and he picked up his book, and the fire burned low and steady between them. They did not talk. They did not need to. Outside, Red Hollow was settling into its second winter since she had arrived, another season of cold and distance, and the particular beauty of a place that asked something real of the people who chose to live in it. And inside Walker Ranch, in the warm and well-lit rooms of a house that had been built by one person and become home to several, the evening went on the way evenings did, quietly, fully, with the specific, unambiguous weight of a life that was real. Clara Whitmore had come to Montana running from the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She had found in the space that opened up when the running stopped that she was capable of something she had almost forgotten, not just surviving, but building. Not just enduring, but choosing. Not just moving away from what had hurt her, but moving deliberately with intention and care, and the hard-won knowledge of someone who understood exactly what she was worth, towards something she had made with her own hands. She had made this house, this marriage, this small, fierce household of people who had found each other at the edges of their own difficult stories and decided quietly and without ceremony to stay. She had made this, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had been owed from the beginning, and everything she had finally, stubbornly, bravely refused to stop believing she deserved. The fire burned. The wind pushed at the walls, and Clara Walker sat in her chair in the home she had built, her hand resting against the quiet promise of the future, and she did not wait for something to go wrong. She was done waiting for things to go wrong. She was home.